The map is indestructible. Part 3 of the title essay of Volume 2 of The True Isn't the Rational, starting with Section 7. If reality is relational, we cannot escape maps, but the same also holds if reality is ultimately abyssal and or lacking, which leads us to the work of Žižek. Now, a relational reality and essentially lacking reality are not necessarily exclusive positions. And it's possible that we experience an essential lack precisely because we must always lack the other to which we relate. In other words, perhaps we are always passing over into an otherness, a B, that we cannot access. In fact, if things don't exist, and yet we must experience things as if reality consists of things, understanding AA, that alone suggests an essential lack, for we lack the capacities to experience reality like it actually is, perhaps fundamentally non-local, as Stuart Kaufmann discusses, or dialectically material, like Žižek considers. Ultimately, though, if models of relational metaphysics are wrong, and hence it doesn't follow that maps are indestructible for that reason, we might be able to establish another ontological reason for ontological maps, if Žižek is right, and humans can't handle a real Lacan without maps. If that was so, reality would consist of maps we cannot destroy without a psychotic break, which would mean maps are practically indestructible, returning us to our dilemma. Žižek is a major inspiration for my personal thinking on maps, and we should note how Glenn Daly described his position in Conversations with Žižek. Reality itself, and this is, I quote, reality itself is always constructed as an attempt to establish a basic consistency against the disintegrative effects of the real. Just as being may be understood as being towards madness, reality is always reality towards the real. By real, we are thinking Lacan, which means that reality consists essentially of a traumatic real that we cannot naturally face, especially not all at once, without being self-effaced. We could think Lovecraft here, with the craft in parentheses, suggested by the quote, while the real, by definition, cannot be directly represented, it can nonetheless be alluded to in certain figurative embodiments of horror excess. It is alluded to in the monster from Scott's film Alien, whose blood literally dissolves the fabric of reality. Reality requires the real, which dissolves it. Now, like releases in Philip Reef, as discussed in Belonging Again Part 1, the real should not be identified exclusively as an explicit force of negation. It also plays a more implicit and evanescent role in the construction of our everyday forms of social reality. Without releases, we would not be free, completely controlled, and organized by givens. Likewise, without the threat of the real, we wouldn't have any social direction of what we should or shouldn't do. Social interactions might be chaotic and dysfunctional. Lack can be good, then, for it can create incentive and motivation for social interaction. If no one was lacking more like God, we might all be alone, incapable of network effects, social coordination. We might be impoverished gods. But lack and the real, at the same time, are also dangerous, for if we face them too much, we can be self-effaced. Hence, we need a filtration system, something like a map. What ideology offers the symbolic construction of reality, the ultimate fantasy, as a way to escape the traumatic effects of the real? Reality is always a virtual take on the real, a virtualization that can never fully overcome the real or achieve homeostasis. Does this mean we are self-deceived? It means we are at risk of that, yes, but it is more like that to live we must look toward the sun. If there are no clouds, and if we cannot blink, we will go blind. Today, for Žižek, we live in the tension designated by Hegel even more than people did in Hegel's own time, which consists of an encountering of the reality that we must avoid the real as we must use maps. Can we be aware of this and the personal and social mechanisms not fail? Is it enough to no longer really believe, just follow? Ideology not only constructs a certain image of fulfillment, it also endeavors to regulate a certain distance from it. But if we know that, will the mechanism still work? If not, the real isn't any more faceable. We do not come too close to it, quote unquote. Reality any less situational, AB. And so it must still be there if we're still here, even if it doesn't work, the map is indestructible. Might we be tempted then to say that nothing is real, a total disavowal that treats all of reality as an illusion? But if external reality is ultimately just an ethereal appearance, then even the most horrifying crimes eventually do not matter. No exit. Every road is hard, for the easy roads are dangerous. Alternatively, if we do not deny the existence of everything or seek a detachment strategy, we can maintain maps through desires that we then use to avoid the real, perhaps like certainty deterrence, as Žižek writes. The ideological trick, therefore, is to keep the object at a certain distance in order to sustain the satisfaction derived from the fantasy, if only I had X, I could fulfill my dream. Ideology regulates this phantasmatic distance in order to, as it were, avoid the real in the impossible. Indeed, so it goes in keeping the map away enough from the territory so that we don't have to experience the map not being the territory, all while we know it isn't. That's hard enough, but at least we can create a feeling of freedom like releases. But unfortunately, a map that denies facing the reality that it isn't the territory or the real is vulnerable to autonomous rationality, which suggests the wisdom in Chesterton's aim to thus save reason through sticking to its founding exception. Deprived of this, reason disintegrates into blind, self-destructive skepticism, and short into total irrationalism, auto-cannibalism, and self-effacement. We should make clear that the map and the territory do not share in a dualistic clearing divide relationship. The map comes from the territory and is itself part of it. Reflexivity is integrated in, as Goethe understood. This also suggests another reason why the map is indestructible, precisely because the territory is indestructible unless we don't exist, and the territory essentially emerges to maps. The way Žižek describes the real could be useful here. The real is thus simultaneously the thing to which direct access is not possible and the obstacle that prevents this direct access, the thing that eludes our grasp and the distorting screen that makes us miss the thing. So it is with the territory. It is what we cannot access and that which consists of and generates the maps which keep it inaccessible. And where there are maps, there are opportunities for self-deception, ever-deferring desire, totalization. The idea of overcoming is sustained as a deferred moment of reconciliation without having to go through the pain of overcoming as such. To live is to live with fire. If maps were destructible in some sense, it would seemingly mean that we could do away with maps and interact directly with territories, which first off isn't possible because we are finite and can't comprehend territories all at once, and instead, through a process of saturation, seem to naturally generate maps at a sufficient point of saturation, alluding to Alex Ebert's work. But second, it could also be the case that because the territory essentially entails maps, which means maps aren't the territory and yet are in it. With Hegel, Žižek believes that to arrive at the absolute, what one has to add to the object order is its appearance itself, a necessary moment. Our very capacity to make appear is essentially part of the territory, for it consists of a real and is directly inexperienceable and hence requires mediation and appearance. And yet this process of appearance is contradictory and lacking, similar to how theology might say God exists as necessarily a being we cannot experience, and yet because there is a God we cannot experience, there is experience at all, of that being even, at least analogously. This, of course, suggests a contradictory process, for it suggests experience is possible from and of what cannot be experienced, and yet, nevertheless, experience must be toward the unexperienced as if experiencing it were possible, which brings to mind Žižek's thoughts on the relationship between abstract and concrete universality. He writes, in a first move, universality has to be asserted in its negativity as exclusive of all particular content, that is to say, not as an all-encompassing container, but as the destructive force which undermines every particular content. And yet it is only when universality, as it were, loses the distance of an abstract container and enters its own frame that it becomes truly concrete. The universal suggests a certain inadequacy and every particularity, and a particular not being the universal itself, and yet the universal is meaningless if it doesn't enter into particularity and hence inadequacy. Thus, we can say that the universal, if meaningful, consists of inadequacy, lack, incompleteness, a, b, so on. This move into and consisting of inadequacy is essentially part of universality, if suggesting a meaningful movement of thought. We can consider here how both Christianity and Hegel transpose the gap which separates us from the absolute into the absolute itself. And so it goes with appearance. Appearance necessarily negates the whole of what appears, as a map necessarily isn't the territory, and yet that very negative act is necessarily part of the territory if appearance itself is somehow essential. A gesture of taking away, which is in itself giving. Otherwise, we're not dealing with a real movement of thought. So are we even thinking? Perhaps not. Rex Butler sees in Žižek a realization that all significant philosophical systems introduce a certain gap or void into what is, a gap or void into what we could call the subject. Subjectivity generates appearance, and if appearance is essential, even while there is no necessary relationship between reality and its symbolization, while subjectivity entails a void, then essence entails void. The question is only what might be the quality of that void, say as a void in the sense of what a situation or a relation must be to a thing which cannot comprehend anything but things, perhaps. I personally lean in this direction, perhaps more apathetic, while in a way might sound positive and apathetic, but please note that I think relations are hard and indeed real. To say the void follows from relations and situations is not for me to necessarily positivize it, for from relations there is no exit. It depends. But I certainly don't think relations can be maintained without facing the real. There is a certain crucifixion required, like Dante's road to Beatrice, as might be required for real materialism. Nothing short of this will ultimately realize the role of critical thinking as to open up another choice. A point of clarification is warranted here, which is the odd fact that though the real is that which we cannot experience, Žižek stresses that the point is that we can encounter the real, and that is what is so difficult to accept. Doesn't that contradict everything we've been saying, though? It seems that way, but really we can encounter that which we cannot encounter, as we can experience that which we can't experience. That's the whole problem. When we suggest the real cannot be experienced, we mean to say that the real is that which undermines our worlds. In a sense, the game is to avoid the real. We could say that the rule of the game, Symbolic, is the real cannot be experienced, bringing to mind how ideology functions as a way of regulating a certain distance with such an encounter and sustains at the level of fantasy precisely what it seeks to avoid at the level of actuality. As Žižek puts it, so to be clear, the real is impossible, but is not simply impossible in the sense of a failed encounter. It is also impossible in the sense that it is a traumatic encounter that does happen, but which we are unable to confront. This is the tricky balance. It must be kept in mind when we discuss the real as that which can be encountered yet, that can't be encountered yet can. That's the whole problem with our real, which is all too possible, and that is what is traumatic. The real arises in ruptures of reality that can't be reality in being ruptures of it, and yet at the same time, the ruptures are only possible because there is a reality, so they are in some sense part of reality. If relations are real, so are ruptures, which we might say bridges Korbowski and Žižek. Furthermore, lacks are not nothing, as Thomas Jockin discusses. In a way, the ruptures of the Lacanian real are precisely more real than reality, in the sense that they unveil more of what is fully possible in reality, unveiling that what we thought was realist reality wasn't at all. But how could we have thought otherwise and functioned? Reality is surprising, and yet surprises can be regular, can't be regular to be themselves. So what do we regularly experience? Something less than reality? Well, the real happens. We cannot justify or explain it. Miraculous, perhaps. Yet this does not mean reality isn't real. The point is not that there is no reality outside our mind. The point is rather that there is no mind outside reality. The distortions of reality occurs precisely because our mind is a part of reality. Because we are, lack is, AB, which means there is nothing to stop us from acting as if lack is nothing, AA, self-effacing. The most horrible thing to encounter for a human being is this abyss of free will. We have spoken much in O.G. Rose of encounterology and the notion that reality is founded in surprises or limits, alluding to Alex Ebert, and I would associate Žižek's rupture and real here with those topics. Furthermore, I am of the opinion that we do not really have a relationship until it surprises us, which necessarily entails a real rupture, and on those grounds I would consider Korbowski, Goethe, Hegel, Whitehead, Barfield, Leibniz, Ebert, and Žižek together. For I believe a relational ontology isn't relational until it is real, which might impact possibilities and evolutions. For monads, bringing Heidegger to mind, Žižek says, I am more and more convinced that consciousness originates with something going terribly wrong, even at the most personal level. For example, when do we become aware of something, fully aware, precisely at the point where something no longer functions properly or not in the expected way? So I think it goes with relations. They meaningfully are when they are real, and if we encounter maps to handle the real, this suggests relations requires maps, emotionally, psychologically, epistemologically, and ontologically. Hence, if society is to be possible, we require maps, and if humans require society, where humans are, maps are indestructible. At the same time, we should be clear that maps don't perfectly represent the real, even though the real forces humans to use maps, as Glenn Daly writes. The intangible real could be said to function like the vanishing point, something that cannot be represented but which is nevertheless constitutive of representations. In quantum physics, by contrast, the real would be the curvature of space, something that cannot be dimensionally determined but which creates the conditions of possibility for dimensionality as such. To put it another way, the real is present in terms of the constitutive paradox whereby a system is able to arise in its forms of internal coherence and unity only insofar as it cannot systemize its own principles of constitution. This suggests Gödel, and it means that the real is present in a map to the degree that it makes the map that which avoids the real, as the territory is present in a map to the degree that the map exists precisely because it isn't the territory and yet is needed because of the territory. This is odd, but it suggests why AA is insufficient for humans and why Korbowski is right that we require something like a B to keep sanity. Stuck in AA, as under Givens, we would treat the symbolic and map as equal to the real and territory, making us radically unprepared for the ruptures of the real that would likely occur, especially under pluralism and globalization, at which point we could psychologically break. The map is indestructible, not necessarily in the sense that it literally can't be destroyed, but in the sense that destroying it has consequences. Furthermore, there's a sense in which we can't destroy maps any more than we can destroy negativity, for maps are what make possible tearing with the negative, precisely in their function to defend us from negativity. We must live with poetry, we might say, for poetry obfuscates the whole, making it palatable and simultaneously tolerable. Section 8. Žižek notes that the real resists full symbolization, but it is at the same time an excess generated by the process of symbolization itself. Without symbolization, there is no real. There is just a flat stupidity of what is there. The real is only itself because of the symbolization it denies ever being fully symbolized into, like a territory that only exists because it isn't its own map. Alluding to thoughts on surprise in O.G. Rose, we could say that the real requires surprise, and hence it requires consistency and regularity to be possible, thus a map. But if the real itself cannot be a consistent state, but rather it must be a rupture, which means it requires something to rupture, ergo a symbolic and or map. When reality dissolves and the only thing remaining is the abyss of subjectivity, when we encounter the real, but we cannot experience an abyss from nothingness, paradoxically, rather we require something, a map, so that in abyss the territory can be experienced. Yet this means the abyss, as distinct from nothingness, arises precisely with symbolization, which is very odd, but it means the subject is always already constituted by a symbolization abyss, we might say, and never shall the two part, or else we are self-effaced. As odd as this sounds, it is arguably common knowledge, at least subconsciously. Even the mass media is aware of the extent to which our perception of reality, including the reality of our innermost self-experience, depends upon symbolic fictions. There is a history of believing that self-consciousness renders self-present and self-transparent, the thing in me which thinks, but Žižek opposes this view, as Korbowski warns of this identification as a source of insanity. This tendency has been part of a long history of a metaphysical endeavor to heal the world of the primordial repression by allocating to the subject a place in the great chain of being, but this medicine has side effects. We, through this history, could habituate ourselves into a blindness to the role of the symbolic, and hence become vulnerable to ideology and maps in ways that contributed to totalization, the banality of evil, oppression, and worse. Furthermore, we could make ourselves mentally fragile, as unveiled with pluralism and globalization, when AA logic could not prove sufficient, and so sanity has broken down, free from givens. In a world where my neighbor is profoundly different from me, I must more so also see the difference in myself. Every tension between notion and reality already implies a minimal notional determination of this otherness, breaking down AA and leaving me in need of something else for life. If AB isn't available, I stay broken down. I am not what I am, with the not in parentheses, for I have no means by which to live a certain difference. For Hegel, identity is the most radical form of difference brought to its self-reference, not just in the obvious sense that a thing's identity is defined by the difference from all other things, but above all in the sense that identity names the difference of a thing with itself, a thing's difference from all its particular properties, each of which can be shared by other things. A thing is not its properties, it is a unique receptacle of its properties. This does not mean that there was no truth to the notion of identity or A. After all, difference is by definition difference between identities. Without identities, the flow of differences becomes a chaotic flow, a formless one. Rather, it means identity is that which passes over into otherness, which means it is always situated. What we need for Korbowski's sanity is to see this, which requires a new symbolic A-B, which we can associate with the parallax view of Žižek, which he describes as the apparent displacement of an object, the shift of its position against the background, caused by a change in observational position that provides a new line of sight. The classic example is if I hold up a finger and close one eye, then the other, my finger will move, yet I won't. The shift is entirely in the observational field, with only the slightest physical shift of an eyelid, which we can associate with a change in symbolic for Korbowski, which seems like nothing happens, and yet in that nothing happening, sanity becomes gainable and sustainable precisely through an act that can seem silly, please note, perhaps like God dying. In Žižek's parallax, like in Korbowski, there is a reflexive twist in which I myself am included in the picture constituted by me, hence generating a situation, AB. But please note that this shift in perspective is itself not empirically viewable. It can look to outsiders and even to ourselves like nothing happened. But indeed, that is what we all need, for nothing to happen, which means we go through nothing versus go from negativity, a move akin to Žižek's Christian atheism. Please also note that parallax might describe shifts between and in monads. Considering Koratani's trans critique, even if Koratani isn't radical enough for him, Žižek considers how entities are discernible only via the irrefutably antimatic character of our experience of reality, which is to say through accepting that things are not what they are, but instead situation, which is a parallax shift, AA to AB, and necessary for Korbowski's sanity. This situation, though, is not something to be overcome, but something integrated with, as evidence that the subject always has what it is looking for, and this is what negation of negation is, the shift of perspective which turns failure into true success, insanity into sanity, sanity into insanity, and so on. I would associate the move between AA to AB with a parallax shift, which is critically not a matter of having two perspectives. Rather, we have a perspective and what eludes it. And also note that a parallax can seem to require an absolute choice, as discussed throughout O.G. Rose, which for our purposes here can simply be understood as a choice that has no basis which can justify it beyond the choice itself. It is absolute. As discussed in the absolute choice, we could associate this choice with the Burdian donkey, which is where a donkey is caught between two equally sized piles of grain and starves because it cannot make a rational decision, say, on the meaning of Goethe's incompleteness. All the donkey can do is make a non-rational decision, but if that's not a category in its thinking, it might be doomed. Similarly, we might consider parallax not something we can rationally choose, for in experience there seems to be reason for AA just as much as AB, especially before we think about it, but something that must be non-rationally accepted. Perhaps the absolute choice itself is all we can hope for as a truth which remains the same in all possible worlds. If so, this suggests something comical where Korbowski's sanity is thanks to something that will seem irrational as non-rationality can, hence a need to face negativity and go through it versus from it. As we've discussed, for Hegel, reality itself appears as an expression of inner essence, and if reality is contradictory, then there is reason to think reality is essentially contradictory, but nothing will force us to see things this way. Yes, we might accept that consciousness is a strictly relational phenomenon, but if consciousness appears such and makes the world appear such as well, this would, for Hegel, suggest that things are such. To split appear and are is a mistake. But again, we have to choose to undergo this parallax. The concepts of parallax shift and absolute choice are deeply connected for me, but how can we choose something we can't see or get until we choose it? It seems to possibly be because we all seem born with a sense that something is lacking. We don't know what or how, but something feels off, and so we can be looking for something that we can't put into words, identify, and so on. We sense a mystery and seek it, like the weight of glory of Lewis, which hardly makes sense, but doing something that hardly makes sense, non-rational, seems to be the only way to deal with this paradox of seeking something we don't see or trying to see something we don't know. We're seeking. Is this situation we find ourselves in why we might have hope against maps and ideology? Perhaps, as it also might provide for us a reason to encounter limits we don't know are limits, which for Alex Ebert is needed if we are to experience the limitless and undergo sublation negation. The failure to do of which means we are stuck in AA versus AB and could suffer self-effacement. This case is elaborated on in The Absolute Choice, particularly the paper Limits Are Limitless. See also episode 161, O.G. Rose Conversation. But the point is that we seem to need a sense of something lacking if we are to have any hope of making an absolute choice for what we can't identify, undergo a parallax if to see the invisible differently, to encounter limits we don't know are limits, which are true limits, and so on. Would we have any hope of addressing these paradoxes without a sense of lack? Perhaps not. Anyway, ultimately, in my view, what Korbowski, Barfield, Leibniz, and so on encourage of us is not simply a change of view, but more precisely a parallax, which again requires an absolute choice, because a parallax must happen in us. It can't really be caused externally, even if we might be externally influenced to make the absolute choice. The justification for the parallax can be found by considering Hegel, where we see appearance as real, and note that if what appears to us consists of contradiction, why couldn't essence itself be contradictory, AB instead of AA? If identification is impossible in appearance, perhaps this is because everything is situation all the way down the monad. The fact we seem to lose sanity, as Korbowski warns, without AB only strengthens the case, meaning we need to accept the reality as AB if we are to avoid insanity. But that means we must work with maps, as we require maps to avoid facing the real too much too quickly. Hence the map is indestructible. But maps could move us into ideology and trouble and prove indestructible. Does this mean rational ontologies entail the real? Relational ontologies entail the real? I think so, which is a great challenge of what Kafka wrote applies. I cannot live with you, and I cannot live without you. The map is indestructible, or we have been destroyed. Section 9. Maps are indestructible as a general concept because reality is relational, situational, Leibniz, excessive, Ebert, and or lacking, Žižek. And if we aren't dealing with maps, we aren't dealing with reality, which brings about pathology, as we are at risk of in dealing with maps. To treat the world as algebraic instead of geometric is not the way, but to accept geometry is to accept a complex world. Furthermore, maps are indestructible also in the sense that their points of weakness can be aligned with essential incompleteness, and hence not seen as evidence deconstructing them, maintaining strength. Considering Gödel, ideology necessarily entails inconsistency. So if I find inconsistency, I don't necessarily have to leave the ideology. I can stay, whether the ideology be true or false, because I can interpret that inconsistency as an essential part of the consistency, perhaps as a mystery, something to be discovered in the future by science and axiom and so on, versus an inconsistency contradicting the consistency of the ideology, as I am also able, because thought is groundless. Thought A is read upon phenomenon A rather than phenomenon A give us or force upon us thought A. And if to save my ideology, I need to read B upon phenomenon A, if I need to define DNA as the ground of humanness versus consciousness, for example, I can do that. Phenomenon A cannot stop me. In other words, the groundlessness of language, perception, and thought can work in favor of ideology. For whenever ideology is threatened, it can simply reorder the system of thought by which the ideology operates. And as long as the ideology maintains its internal consistency, the ideology can continue without missing a beat. I have that power. power that seems irrational not to use. If we are not aware of the inherent and inescapable groundlessness of being, we won't realize that all ideology will entail a space to redefine and protect itself, not because it is necessarily true, but because it is ideology. A map and/or ideology is that which is inconsistent, i.e. in parentheses, inconsistent in its consistency, while an idea is that which is either consistent or inconsistent relative to an inconsistent ideology, idea, or notion. Hence, that which is actually an ideology, as opposed to a bad idea, is that which is consistent, and hence that which cannot, within itself, readily be found to be false. But recall that a reason I would leave an ideology is because I found it was inconsistent, as opposed to essentially inconsistent, as a result of reflecting on it because of the other. But if the ideology I am in is totally consistent, inconsistent, in parentheses, then any possible manner in which I reflect on it as a result of the other will easily stand up to the scrutiny. My you will find nothing inconsistent, and hence no reason to abandon the ideology as not an ideology. Because the ideology is groundless, nothing but myself can challenge it. But anyway I challenge it, the ideology will easily stand, increasing my confidence that I am right to stand with it, even if the ideology is actually false. Considering Wittgenstein, the more consistent the ideology is, the more certain I can become that I don't need to challenge it. And even if I did, if the ideology is truly an ideology, I would seemingly find I was right to be certain that I didn't need to challenge it, for the ideology would stand to scrutiny. The more consistent our ideology becomes, the more our ideology realizes it is actually an ideology, the more certain we can become about it, which is to say, establish certainty deterrence, when how consistent an ideology is doesn't necessitate that it is truer. A system, map, and/or ideology could be true relative to its axioms and rules of inference, yet false. But if certainty is ultimately impossible, what else do we have to garner a sense of what could be true than by consistency? We seemingly must think the more consistent an ideology is, the truer it is, but we might achieve a completely flawless and consistent being rational erected upon a being true that is entirely false. Given that the map usefully depicts the territory, the more consistent an ideology and/or subjectivity, which we have control over protecting and maintaining, the more certain we can become that it is proper for the ideology subjectivity to necessarily strike us as objective and/or axiomatic, when the level of consistency of an ideology doesn't necessarily increase how objective axiomatic the ideology is. A consistent or complete ideology could be absurd. The more objective an ideology strikes us, the more we can feel no need to critically think about it, when what needs to be questioned is precisely that which doesn't seem to us that it needs to be questioned. Additionally, we can simply define those points as the essential inconsistencies of the ideology, perhaps as the necessary axioms that cannot be proven or disproven, and furthermore form certainty deterrence over those weak points, making them true because they must be true for anything to be true. I have that power. Surely maps are not indestructible, though, for don't people leave Christianity, abandon conservatism, and so on? Has there never been change? A fair counter. But it should be stressed that I am not arguing people can't change, but that in an ideology nobody must necessarily change. Also, if people do change, it is doubtful that the change is a result of a purely rational process. They probably also had emotional experiences that changed the stickiness of their ideology, as discussed in Compelling by O.J. Rose. People can work to avoid these experiences, though, keeping their maps strong, and ultimately this means that if people are unwilling to move beyond their maps versus, say, try to deconstruct them, nothing must necessarily change them. If it really is the case that the map is indestructible, what hope do we have in our pluralistic age? If, according to indestructible ideology A, ideology B is to be erased from the face of the earth, and vice versa, there is little hope for A and B to live in peaceful community unless, say, ideology A betrays itself. And who, in good conscience, would do this, considering the existential angst this would necessarily cause, considering Peirce, and considering that the ideologies don't necessitate this abandonment within themselves precisely because they are consistent? Perhaps our only hope is to step into an ideology and find an inconsistency that isn't essential, but contradictory in such a way that the ideologue cannot interpret the inconsistency as essential, but must necessarily admit that the inconsistency unveils the ideology to not be an ideology, but a bad idea or problematic notion. But it is on this point that the pitch and risk must be noted, the risk and Kafkaesque joke that makes the challenge of ideology so great. Language, thought, and ideology weave together as a map. As long as they are inconsistent, i.e. in parentheses, function well enough that we are prone to confuse the signifier with the signified, and yet are groundless, which is to say that living with words and thoughts is to live in a world similar to Odysseus. It's just not until the internet that we could be connected to everything to end up like Byron the Bulb. The more on that at another time. Following Alfred Korbowski as S.I. Harakia writes, there is no necessary connection between the symbol and that which is symbolized, and this ultimately makes ideology indestructible and us at risk of seeing something when there is nothing. The situation in which we are positioned like Odysseus cannot be destroyed. And the very human condition that puts us in this situation, thought, language, signification, relation, is also what makes us prone to end up seeing things mad in what Haraki calls semantic confusion, for reasons Haraki suggests well when he writes that the word rattlesnake, for example, and the actual creature are felt to be one and the same thing, but they arouse the same feelings. The memory, which makes signification possible, also brings with it emotion and experience that makes the signifier seem like the signified, possibly and gradually training us into a semantic confusion in which we are then unprepared to be in Odysseus' situation, too prone to see fake connections, and yet it is the very signification which can so wrongly habituate us that puts us in this situation in the first place. We are always at risk of seeking to learn about things that we invent in the process of seeking them, perhaps precisely because it is relations all the way down, and the world is conditioned by us, perhaps following Barfield, Leibniz, Hegel, so on, those whom can plot against reality. Because reality is AB, not AA, we can interpret it as AA, and furthermore always be vulnerable to the reality that to discover may be the same thing as inventing. Furthermore, we are at risk of this because we must invent and create signifiers in order to get at the present territory, whatever that is. And yet, though symbols and things symbolized are independent of each other, nevertheless, all of us have a way of feeling as if, and sometimes acting as if, there were necessary connection. Does Baudrillard's Death of the Real amplify this problem? Is that a real, false connection? We must. If we really believed and acted as if the map wasn't the territory, we would not function, as a bad actor cannot forget his or herself in the character. And yet the map isn't the territory. The actor isn't the role. Hence, in a sense, to function in this world, we must act crazy. Odysseus is practical. Sanity is insane, with the IN in parentheses. Two important characteristics of maps should be noticed. A map is not the territory it represents, but, if correct, it has a similar structure to the territory which accounts for its usefulness. Hence, the practical is located in the space between truth and fiction, but sanity is possible because Lacan is right and the truth is structured like a fiction, which sounds insane. What Odysseus is doing is very much like reading a book. Frank Kermode tells us, Odysseus from Thomas Pynchon, Crying of Lot 49. And so the same applies to us in following maps. Aren't words on a page guiding our eyes? Following maps and reading books is similar. Both are ways to read signs, we might say. A good interpretation is like the book we are reading, even if not equivalent to it. And yet if we treat an interpretation as just an interpretation, it would have no power or authority. Similarly, if Odysseus treated the connections she thought she saw as just possibilities, they couldn't inspire her actions, and then she might be ill-prepared and in danger. That's the rub. If we dismiss our thoughts as just thoughts, we must be at risk of not being able to navigate our lives, not being able to protect ourselves from possible plots against us, as we discussed with David Hume, not being able to learn the deeper truths of reality. To avoid risk is to avoid life. Where there is no possibility of the normal hermetic activity ending up in a disease, we are in danger. No exit, always possibly ending up in socially segregated sub-universes of meaning, as Berger and Luckman discuss. If we are always already in a situation, we are always already in a situation AB. What concerns us in the Crying of Lot 49 is precisely the existence of what seems to be systems that could transmit meanings, as in the account of San Narcissica, the town which looks like a printed circuit, an intent to communicate. Likewise, what concerns us are maps and situations from which meaning emerges. A revelation trembles in progress all around. and we are always already in situations, which means we are all living as if reading books. To read is to be toward meaning, and to situate is similar. The map is not the territory, but all of us require maps, which means we are all in a position and so habituated to consciously or subconsciously feel the need of a revelation, the sense that such situations exist to transmit sense. Should we follow that feeling and trust it, give ourselves over to it, everything can be legitimized, systemized, yes, no? We risk a kind of madness, which is the ultimate human cost of holding everything together in a single design, which is what a map must function to do. To think is to risk madness. Sanity is insane, IN in parentheses. Or so we are invited to find out as a speaking animal who must approach a world in which we have introduced our communication systems. Where there are no maps or symbolic, we are overwhelmed by the real, exactly as Lacan and Žižek warn, and yet where there are maps, we find ourselves situated to end up like Odifia, ready to see another mode of meaning behind the obvious, which functions as a possible source of hope, meaning, and or madness, which at the same time can draw us toward a real or beauty for which we are easily not prepared. Lovecraftian. Furthermore, the map we live according to might be one we are trained, tricked, etc., into absorbing, perhaps from institutions, families, religions, governments, and so on, the result of deliberate conspiracies to confuse and control. Even when we experience a manifestation of the sacred, what arguably the crying of Lot 49 dramatizes, alluding to Maurice Elandia, and that too might be a trick. Choose, absolutely choose, regardless. Something, therefore, which we call a chair, may be expressed or described by words, yet the situation is not altered because the given description or expression will not be the actual objective level, which we call a chair. However obvious these facts may appear at first glance, they are actually not so obvious as they seem, except when we take special pains to think about the subject. Symbols and things symbolized are independent of each other. Nevertheless, all of us have a way of feeling as if, and sometimes acting as if, there were necessary connections. Whatever we choose, things will be what things are, which are not equivalent to our understandings of, and yet the act of trying to understand what is can change what is, if indeed relations are all. We must fail, but the effort at which we fail changes what is, like a creative. Faulkner fails at describing Caddy, and yet the world, which includes his failure, is better for it. Even if we make a wrong choice, the world can nevertheless be better because we are in it choosing, and yet bad choices can be made. Harold Bloom tells us that Odifia's quest is to discover how and why to read the story in which she finds herself. Pitchin's Odifia is not always a good reader, but she deserves her first name. Like Sophocles' Odysseus, she unceasingly seeks the truth. Again, Bloom tells us Pitchin is Kabbalistic, and Bloom also tells us the emphasis upon interpretation is finally what distinguishes Kabbalah from nearly every other variety of mysticism or theosophy, east or west. This all in mind. In our age of maps and ever-pluralizing maps, thanks to the internet, globalization, pluralism, and so on, which we refer to as the problem of internally consistent systems, we might say that we were all Kabbalistic now, trying to read the signs of the time, though Bloom notes reading is always a defensive process. Is this a reason the world feels fragile? Everyone is fearful and defensively reading and trying to make sense of everything, forced to work with maps like Odifia in this world of situation, AB, without which we will suffer the real and be self-effaced. The map is indestructible. Alan Friedman and Manifold Poots claim that Thomas Pynchon is an author in search of a metaphor for that which no metaphor seems able to capture. Likewise, we search for a map that cannot be the territory. Bringing Yeats to mind, Molly Height explains that the trope of the absent center supplies the motive for making patterns out of language in Pynchon, which we can associate with absent territory motivating us to make maps. Height further writes that the human being trying to construct meanings because the premise that the center did not hold constitutes an original loss. Likewise, our experience of a loss of the territory, an original loss that colors every moment of map making. I'd also tell us that the search for meaning could not occur if the searchers were not aware of the possibility of enlightenment, and similarly, we would not bother with maps if there was no chance of them being like the territory. So why couldn't they equal it? If they can be like it, doesn't that mean semblance is possible? So why not entirely possible? Indeed, why not? And so there is reason to end up like Odifia. Why not? Are we to be non-rational? But the search must articulate connections, and the dual sense of setting such connections apart and of speaking them. The condition of articulation, which governs the secular worlds of novels, guarantees that the indivisible silent center will remain always out of reach. Language can only divide, recombine, violate the perfection of silence with the noisy incompleteness of always saying, yet saying means. Indeed, awareness of this is necessary for the art of map making, which means we must learn what Haraki, Korbowski, and the like teach us in this world of situation and relations. Just by being, we are always at risk of pitching, but the pitch and risk is where we face the risk versus run from it. The very fact of language seems to point back to an original creation, an original named. The very use of a map seems to point back to a lost territory, and it is impossible to mean without feeling this. To overcome it, we can be tempted to act as if the map is the territory, for that way we can begin working to convince ourselves that we've lost nothing at all, thus addressing and erasing the feeling. To allude to Haraki, human survival revolves around different kinds of fittedness from that of the lower animals, and part of that fitness is proving able to not give into this temptation, which means we know the map isn't the territory and yet use indestructible maps. All the same, aware of the risks outlined in Pitchin, our fate is tied to our relation with the symbolic in maps, which is to say finding the proper assumptions about the relationships of language to reality, the very work of which tempts us to fall into temptations Haidt describes in Pitchin, for the drive to make meaning out of the world can easily and almost imperceptibly turn into the compulsion to make the world totally coherent and explicable, the auto-cannibalistic mistake of autonomous rationality which girdle with incompleteness can save us from, but only in the context of a situation in which Pitchin is a risk. In our semantic environment, like a Pitchin novel, how should we live? AB instead of AA for one, as we learn in Korbowski and Hegel, suggesting that to understand the symbolic process is to be able to use it to our advantage, not to understand it is to remain forever its victim. People need to be semantically aware of the powers and limitations of symbols, especially words, if they are to guard against being driven into complete bewilderment by the complexity of their semantic environment. Odifia seems to be an example of someone who is not semantically aware of the powers and limitations of symbols. But are we any better even if we know of these dangers? How can we change our lifestyle? There's no way to escape the danger entirely, no. But if we are aware that we must play with fire, then we will focus on mastering the craft versus trying to put the fire out or acting foolishly. We are in danger. Knowing this, in response, we must choose how we will live. AA or AB, childlike or not. The AB of reality that makes possible recognizing maps as not the territory and hence not AA is also what makes them indestructible. But that does not mean we must be doomed. We simply must adjust. We simply have to absolutely choose anew. Section 10. Humans would likely not have maps or symbolics if they did not have language. Hence a reason why psychoanalysis focuses so much on language, a study of which can help us understand how ideology works through symbolics in light of the real. As Žižek brilliantly helps us realize. Why is language so unique? S.I. Haraki helps us approach that question, noting that language in short can be about language. This is a fundamental way in which human noise-making systems differ from the cries of animals. Likewise, human images can be about something other than the images themselves, and humans are able to see images in their imagination that aren't there before them. Additionally, animals struggle with each other for food or for leadership, but they do not, like human beings, struggle with each other for things that stand for food or leadership, such things as are paper symbols of wealth. We live in an environment shaped and largely created by hitherto unparalleled semantic influences, so much so that for humans it is often more important to have the symbol than what it stands for, though this would never be the case for animals. Humans are willing to die for symbols. We'll die for an idea of food even if we can't see it. This is our blessing and curse. The semantic problems of correct symbolism underlie all human life. Incorrect symbolism, similarly, has also tremendous semantic ramifications and is bound to undermine any possibility of our building a structurally human civilization. To be in AA versus AB makes a world of difference, as Korbowski dedicated his life to elucidating. And according to him, sanity is connected in correct symbolism. Unfortunately, thanks to ideology and consistency, we can go a long time being sane and being insane, and then one day things break. We read unconsciously into the world the structure of the language we use, and likewise we unconsciously read into the world the ideology we live by, which can work for a long time, and perhaps easily for a lifetime before globalization and pluralism. But times have changed and givens broke, and now we must increasingly face the reality of maps, which puts us at risk of ending up like Odifia, precisely in realizing that maps exist and hence that we can be deceived or guided toward the territory. We see that humans can connect the world together, but also that what we connect together might be false. We are held together by truths structured like fictions, or fictions structured like truths. Is there a difference? Connection is a word of love and madness, passion. Persistent training, Korbowski wrote, seems the only way to acquire this special structural sense for proper evaluation, and the habit of feeling when identification or the confusion of orders of abstractions become particularly dangerous. In other words, if we are going to live according to AB and reason, capital R, Hegel illusion, versus AA and understanding, we have to regularly work at it, suggesting the need for a gym where we can regularly train, perhaps like the liminal web, as discussed notably in 2.2 Belonging Again. In this gym, our goal would not be to change the symptom directly, but by the understanding of its main mechanism, try to change the patient's standards of evaluation, of which the symptom is only a consequence. Reminiscent of psychoanalysis, the hope is to understand more than solve, for we need to address the way of life we cannot escape versus find a way to escape it. Interestingly, Korbowski emphasizes visualization as notably helpful for overcoming identification, given its special semantic importance, and yet he also critiques allness as problematic. The issue strongly rests in how we evaluate the world, and Korbowski considers children and many idiots to help frame his science of sanity, and notes they often struggle with any choice which involves meaning and evaluation. Unfortunately, most adults evaluate according to identification, and that contributes to insanity. And if our problem rests in evaluation, it rests in the question of if we operate according to AA or AB, a meta-judgment, as 2.2 discusses, and for Korbowski it is critical that we live by non-identification. This seems simple enough, but the challenge is great. When non-identity is pointed out, even a moron will agree or wonder at the silliness of any author who fusses about it. Yet because all of us were trained in a linguistic and semantic system based on identity, that infantile identification will unconsciously play havoc on us the rest of our lives, unless the semantic blockage is counteracted. We are hence in trouble under our present education systems and evolutionary systems. We speak often in O.G. Rose about the problem of trivial education, inspired by Neil Postman, who first brought Alfred Korbowski to my attention. And here we can say that we are trained by the trivial to associate AA and identification with being educated and intelligent, risking self-effacement, which is made all the worse by what seems to be a natural tendency toward the AA and Kafka-like, as discussed in 2.1. Trivial emphasizes identification, AA, while dialogos and liminal education would emphasize process and relation, AB. And if the first would help us with sanity, we are currently educating and training the world toward insanity. Hence, we must have an infantile society, AA. Madness is not a mistake, but a feature. Rational. Why our destinies should be dependent on the accidental and primitive structure of the language we use is beyond comprehension. Globalization connects the world, but in another sense, it helps us realize the connections which were always present. Reality is AB, situational and relational, all the way down. And this truth can be found suggested in the Kabbalah up through Hegel, Whitehead, Pitchen, and others. As the world globalizes and givens fail, the more following the symbolic of AA will lead to pathologies, exactly as Alfred Korbowski warned, which means we must realize the AB-ness of the world that has always already been the case and negate sublate into an AB symbolic to align with actuality. Following Hegel, we collectively and historically easily had to go through AA before we could be ready for AB. But now, if we don't negate sublate into AB when the age calls for it, we will continue to suffer self-effacement. We have reached the fullness of time, we might say, which we could also frame as when everything is connected. But in living in such a world, which is connected technologically, socially, metaphysically, economically, will we go mad or love? Will we be Odifia or childlike? The choice is made in the same situation. Looking ahead to The Absolute Choice by O.G. Rose, it should be noted that Emancipation After Hegel by Todd McGowan, which emphasizes contradiction in Hegel over rationality, as traditionally emphasized, is a stress which aligns with what we have argued in this paper, and we might say that the more our world has globalized and pluralized, the more we have found contradiction, which is to say AB, an essential and unavoidable dimension of social existence. What Hegel calls spirit Geist is just the capacity of thought to apprehend contradiction rather than merely succumbing to it as the natural world does, which means humans can respond and address contradiction, not that we do. In fact, it could be argued that much of history is a story of trying to avoid contradiction, while Hegel would have us focus on contradiction to develop history and thought. Rationality does not so much develop by avoiding contradiction and deeming it irrational, hence othering it, but by facing and reconciling with it. In globalization and pluralism, we might say we've run out of ways and plausible deniability to avoid contradiction within AA. And so now we have to face what was always already the case, AB, and so we require a social coordination infrastructure like the liminal web to so help us face and manage that reality. Both childhood and Odifia can result from the same situation. The difference is orientation and training. Otherwise, our sanity will continue to suffer. Contradiction is even more important to Hegel than he himself thought, and so it is to us as well. Let us other it no more, a mistake which orients us to seek a unity against contradiction versus a reconciliation with it. The subject's ability to recognize contradiction distinguishes it from objects in the world, McGowan tells us, and so it goes with our ability to recognize monad situations and rainbows, RCRs. This recognition is necessary for our sanity, and yet again, we often use this recognition to remove and ignore contradiction versus reconcile with AB, hence the need for a negation sublation of logic from Aristotle to Hegel, as stressed at Philosophy Portal with Cadell last. For Hegel, a value of formal thinking is using it as a foil not to be perverse, but to show how thought is always at odds with itself. Similarly, Korbowski uses identification to show its incompleteness, as Leibniz uses algebra to show a need for geometry. Hegel accepts misidentification as the only possible form that identification could take. And yet this seems like madness, while at the same time it can sound romantic, avoiding objectification, honoring, and loving, to say we never fully know our lover, for example. We might avoid such a Hegelian realization because it can feel like everything is unknowable and unintelligible. But the ability to feel like life being damaged points toward the end of life, but at the same time, it is life. It can feel like it is breaking down our minds to think, but everything is connected that we experience, for everything is situation. Faced with the notion everything is connected, while equipped with AA instead of AB, we use a symbolic that is inadequate, which, as Korbowski warned, leads to madness. In a globalized world, where we are increasingly forced by history to realize everything is connected and everything is situation, AB, we increasingly require a symbolic of AB, or otherwise the mismatch will increasingly prove self-effacing. We will experience everything is connected as madness more than love. Section 11. A great insight of Pitchin is that the phrase everything is connected describes both a world of love and a world of madness, 1 or 0, as discussed in Gravity's Rainbow. And where there is the potential for love, there is also the potential for madness, which I capitalize here to suggest their Pitchian sense. Which side of this coin we realize will be up to us and how prepared we are for the absolute choice, which ultimately is the question of if we will be children, which begs the question, what kind of map will we use? Do all maps equally depict connections as matters of love or madness? It's hard to say, especially without Hegel, for fundamentally maps connect things together, and in this sense all a map makes us toward love/madness. To map live and map make is to connect and establish consistency, which suggests a map can habituate us consciously or subconsciously toward experiencing everything as connected, just like dream equality from 2-2, belonging again, suggesting we are doubly trained. But can maps help us experience love or madness? Are the two so easily separated? Don't we experience love as a madness and even madness as a form of love? Perhaps the historic connection between love and madness, and even their inescapability, is precisely a result of our map lives, which is inescapable precisely because reality is situational and without maps. The real overwhelms us. We said that we must believe in our maps for them to work, as we must also trust them and be willing to give ourselves over to them, all of which is like a love relationship, but at the same time, Maps aren't the territory, and to treat them like they are is in a way madness. We must see connections that we believe are there, and yet we cannot know with certainty they are, and yet we practically can't think that without proving dysfunctional. Madness love is required for functioning, which is odd and a truth that maps can help us avoid facing and subconsciously habituate us from experiencing. At the same time, maps habituate us toward experiencing everything is connected, which means maps can shield us from madness love, while at the same time leading us toward it. A trap? Like Lovecraft? It could be. But that will depend on us. And yet, if we increasingly become pathological as we approach the realization everything is connected, this could function as a warning sign of a need for some absolute choice from AA to AB, or precisely B, or fate. In this way, like purgatory, pathology and suffering could be a grace or a continuation of inferno. What is our absolute choice as we realize everything is connected, a state of love madness as we have been gradually habituated toward through map making? We must choose how everything is connected. Is it such through an equal sign of identification, AA, or is it through relations, dialectics, and situation, AB? We must decide if love equals madness, AA, or if love situates with madness, AB. But unfortunately, because we are naturally AA in understanding, we are likely to end up in the first option without spreading childhood the concerns of belonging in part 2, which is self-effacing. To become conscious that the map isn't the territory is an opportunity for AB and reason, even though this reality is why the mistake of AA is even possible, and something we don't even have to necessarily abandon. But the initial experience of AB without training can be one of madness that we can interpret as evidence that we should stay in AA, and hence self-effacement. And such is likely without awareness or preparation. Furthermore, to experience AB can initially be an experience that everything isn't connected, for the map isn't the territory. And yet what we have been subconsciously trained and habituated our entire lives by are maps like dream equality into being toward the world as if everything is connected, AA. And isn't it? Yes, in a way, but how the world is such matters. For again, the difference between identification, the equal sign, and dialectic situation changes everything as itself. The map isn't the territory, and yet they are connected. That is a key Hegelian move that is so difficult, but it brings together connection without identification, a crucial achievement of dialectics. It would seem to avoid madness to make it equal love, but this identification can actually guarantee it, unprepared for the real. Alternatively, to accept madness and love are situated together seems to guarantee madness, but actually it can give us an opportunity to master ourselves and keep madness from eclipsing love. The map is indestructible, and yet it can be negated, sublated but how? Through faithful presence, as we'll later explore in The True Isn't the Rational, which entails integration with lack. Regardless, though, our maps make everything connected. And then one day, we might realize everything is connected and find ourselves having to divide love and madness while at the same time keeping them related, but perhaps having never learned how to be Hegelian as such, meaning we are vulnerable to pathology. Karabowski's work was to help us avoid this fate, but this road to childhood requires us to accept that we are insane, with the I in parentheses, because we must make and hence be lovers mad. How do love and madness relate? As one and the same identification AA, or all with all dialectic AB. This question in mind, we might consider a question Žižek asked. Is what we call philosophy still able to account for what quantum mechanics is dealing with? Bothness we can see as equality, AB as we can see as AA. If philosophy can, perhaps nothing can. But if there's potential in philosophy, there's potential for us. The map is indestructible because love/madness is inescapable, yes. But love madness we dwelt with faithfully could be trained through negation, sublation, into empowerment and even beauty. And the fate of beauty is the fate of us. For more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com, Twitter, Anchor, Instagram, Anchor, so on and so forth. You can find our books on Amazon, and all purchases and reviews are deeply appreciated. And thank you so much for your time.